There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. Today's video is all about steel ingots, steel beams, and steel pipes. These are the three most basic steel resources in the game, and as you can see, they've all got different alternate recipes. But the question is, which one's best? Well, as usual, I've split them all into their different categories, and we'll be trying to find the best recipes in regards of power, resources, and time consumption as well. We'll be starting off with steel ingot, since this is the most important part of steel processing. Firstly, we've got the regular steel ingot recipe, which just uses iron ore coal to make your steel ingots. Second recipe is the coke steel ingot, which comes from iron and petroleum coke to make your steel ingots, and petroleum coke then comes from crude oil. Then your third recipe is the solid steel ingot, which is actually iron ingots rather than iron ore, and coal to make your steel ingots. And the final recipe is compact steel ingot, which requires compact coal and iron ore. The reason as to why I say this is the most important recipe to do with steel is because if you get this part wrong, then everything else in the game that requires steel is also just going to cost you more, and it could just be a massive pain in the backside. And there's a lot of items in the game that require steel, such as versatile frameworks, which is a space elevator part, stators, which again is a very important item, and of course the encased industrial beam, which is again a very important item. So let's check out the basic recipe, and to make the 100 steel ingots, which all of these recipes will be making 100 steel ingots per minute, you are going to need, very simply, 100 iron ore and 100 coal per minute. Then to use this, we are using roughly 2.3 foundries, which consumes about 40 megawatts worth of power. This is the most basic recipe in the game, and it's the one that most players use. But is it the best? Well, the answer is actually no, and we'll find out the reason why a little bit later on. And again, in total, we are using 100 iron ore and 100 coal per minute. Recipe number 2 is the solid steel ingot. And again, to make our 100 steel ingots, we actually need less resources than before. We are only consuming 67 coal per minute and 67 iron ingots per minute, which of course it's a 1-to-1 ratio with the iron ore, which then means we're only consuming 67 iron ore per minute, which is about a third less of the resources than our first recipe, which is really good. And you might be thinking, well, this obviously consumes more power because you now have to add in an additional smelter. Well, that's not entirely accurate, because we are consuming just shy of 40 megawatts worth of power. These first two recipes here are almost identical in regards of power consumption. However, this is slightly less power hungry, and of course you end up saving quite a bit of extra resources here as well. So instantly, this recipe is better than the basic steel ingot recipe in the game, so I do recommend that you use this. But we've still got 2 more recipes left to go. Recipe number 3 is the coke steel ingot, and I don't necessarily recommend that you use this recipe, and we'll get into the reason why in just a second. Firstly, to make our 100 steel ingots, we need 75 iron ore. This is more than our previous recipe, but is still less than our first basic recipe. The next part of this recipe though is the main problem. We also need 75 petroleum coke. This petroleum coke then requires your 25 heavy oil residue. This then requires 18.75 crude oil. However, there is also another way to make the heavy oil residue if you use a secondary recipe or another alternate recipe. Regardless though, you are still going to be consuming a fair amount of crude oil. So unless you've got a bunch of heavy oil residue sitting around and you don't know what to do with it, I don't recommend that you use this steel ingot recipe. Unless, again, you just have a bunch of heavy oil residue, or you've got a bunch of petroleum coke and you want to try and find a way to just to get rid of this coke, then yeah, you can definitely turn it into the steel ingot recipe. In regards to power though, unfortunately, because we are using 2 refineries here and a foundry, you are going to be consuming quite a bit of power. So in total, we are consuming 75 iron ore, which is okay, but the good part is we are not consuming any coal. So if you're trying to save out on your coal from the last 2 recipes, which both consume coal, This recipe might appeal to you slightly more, but bear in mind there is like 40,000 coal that you can try and get per minute in your world, and crude oil is far more valuable than coal is in the game currently. Just very quickly, if you enjoy videos like this and you want more guides, tips and tricks, then feel free to subscribe if you wish. You don't have to, but it's a good way to support the channel. You'll also get notified whenever I drop one of these videos. Thank you for all the continued support on the channel, but without further ado, let's get straight back into the video. So those are the first 3 recipes we've talked about. Now let's get on to our final steel ingot recipe, which is the compacted steel ingot. This thing requires iron ore and compact coal. The thing about compact coal is that this is not like regular coal because it involves sulfur. Also, compact coal is very important if you go down the route of turbo fuel, since this is used to make your turbo fuel for most of the recipes. The good part is you're only consuming 25 coal per minute, and you're only consuming 50 iron ore per minute, which is the lowest amount of iron ore and the lowest amount of coal consumed if we're not including that third recipe which doesn't deal with coal. The down part is though, you do have to consume sulfur, which again is rather valuable. If you do end up, what was that? Was that my arm? It's like a bird just like went, it doesn't matter. The good news is though, if you are out of sulfur, don't panic, because this machine right here, which is called the converter, essentially constructs sulfur using a little bit of iron. That is right, when you combine a reanimated SAM, which is just made from SAM, or just SAM, combine that with a bit of iron, you can then make some sulfur. You can also combine it with coal as well, but again, you do also have to use reanimated SAM for this. So if you do run out of sulfur, in fact, if you run out of any of these items that you currently see on screen, then feel free to use the converter. The only problem is that this thing is unlocked at tier 9 or phase 5 of the hubs. It's a very, very late game item. And as you probably won't be able to, oh no, you can just about see, it does consume a lot of power. So do bear that in mind whilst you're making this. Unfortunately, the power consumption is the highest out of all 4 of the recipes, where you have to, unfortunately, use up 75 megawatts, roughly 75 megawatts worth of power, since you are going to be needing 4 foundries and 1 assembler to actually make your compact coal. So let's recap steel ingots with these 4 recipes down here. The basic recipe consumes 100 iron ore per minute and 100 coal per minute. The solid steel ingot alternate recipe consumes 67 iron ore per minute and 67 coal per minute, which also has the best power consumption rates out of all 4 recipes, even though the basic recipe is also rather good as well. The third recipe only requires 75 iron ore, which is still quite a lot, and 18.75 crude oil. The good news is it doesn't involve coal like every other recipe does, but it involves crude oil, which one would argue, this is always up for debate, but I would say crude oil is more valuable than coal, so do bear that in mind if you do choose this recipe. And lastly, for the steel ingots, we've got the compact steel ingot recipe, which requires the least amount of iron ore consumed, the least amount of coal being consumed, but does require sulfur and consumes the most amount of power. But these are your 4 items here to make your steel ingots. I would recommend personally going with a solid steel ingot. Just to remind you, this is how you make it. It's extremely simple, it's rather fantastic, because you're saving on iron, you're saving on coal, you're saving on power, and it's rather easy to make as well. Moving on now from our steel ingots to our steel beams, where we've got 3 more recipes here. You've got the basic recipe, which just requires your steel ingots to steel beam. You then have your aluminium beam recipe, which requires, yes, aluminium ingots, which is a whole thing. We'll get into it in just a minute, don't you worry. And finally, we've got molded beams, which is rather fascinating. And again, we'll talk about that in just a moment. But first of all, let's start with the basic steel beam recipe. And here we have it. To make our 20 steel beams, and again, all 3 of these recipes will be making 20 steel beams, we have to consume 80 steel ingots, which is a 4:1 ratio. To make these 80 steel ingots, we are going to need 54 coal per minute and 54 iron ingots per minute, which requires 54 iron ore. As you can tell, we are using our steel ingot alternate recipe from earlier. If I didn't use this alternate recipe that I just showed you, we would have to consume 80 iron ore and 80 coal per minute. So that just goes to show you that we are saving resources here just from using our last piece of advice I gave you just a minute ago from our steel ingots. So that's fantastic. In regards to power consumption, we are using 2 foundries, 2 smelters, and 2 constructors. So we are using a maximum of 80 megawatts per minute. Again, this is a maximum power usage if everything here is running at 100% efficiency, which some of the foundries won't be. So again, that's a maximum consumption of 80 megawatts. This recipe is not too bad. Again, you're only really consuming 54 iron ore and 54 coal per minute to make your 20 steel beams. It is okay. Our next recipe here is the aluminium beam. And to make our 20 steel beams, we need to make 20 aluminium ingots. To make our 20 aluminium ingots, we need 40 aluminium scrap. To make our 40 aluminium scrap, we need 13.4 coal per minute. And we also need alumina solution, where we then make water in the process. And then to make the alumina solution, we then need bauxite and water. This, as you can probably tell, is very overcomplicated. Just compare this for a minute to the basic recipe. Iron and coal, make it into your ingots, and that's it. Compared to this, we have to combine bauxite and water to solution, and solution to coal to make the scrap, where you get excess water, then you have to loop it back around. You then make the ingots, and then you make the beams. It's extremely complicated for something that just simply doesn't have to be that complicated. So, you can use it if you want, and in fact, there's actually a reason why you might want to, and that's because of the resources that we're consuming to make it. It does say that we are consuming 22.5 water per minute, but obviously if you so wish, you can just loop your water that you're making from here back around into this part, where you're only having to consume about, 9 water per minute there? Which is not too bad at all. 13.4 coal per minute, which is fantastic. The downside though for me is the bauxite. I feel like bauxite is very, very important, and I'm trying to save it for recipes that have to use bauxite, whereas steel beams just don't necessarily require bauxite. You don't have to do this, but of course, if you so wish, then that's completely fine. However, I would say, if you're currently already making aluminium ingots, if you've already got your bauxite factory set up and running completely fine, and you've got excess aluminium ingots left over and you don't know what to do with it, then yeah, definitely feel free to use it as steel beams. And of course, if you then don't need the steel beams, you can sink it, and you can get a good amount of points from sinking it there as well. I do honestly feel like this is quite over the top though, just to make steel beams. When we look at the resources required to make this thing though, we need a smelter, a constructor, a water extractor, which I'll get onto in just a moment, as I'll always do my water extractor temper tantrum as I do in these videos, and the refineries, but you also get some water as well. In total, if everything's running at 100% efficiency, you are consuming 88 megawatts. But the good news is, despite these refineries requiring 30 megawatts each, you're not actually using them at 100% efficiency. So you're only roughly using about 40 megawatts worth of power to make this thing. Very quickly, I will talk about the water extractor. To get your water over to your aluminium solution factory, you're going to have to belt it over. You could either use trucks, trains, drones, or you could turn it into a solid, then belt it across. You could leave it as a pipe. So this part can be quite annoying to transport your water to your refinery. Unless, of course, you build your refinery on water level or near a water source, which definitely does help. And then you have to belt everything else towards it. So again, this is very overcomplicated. To summarize what we've talked about here, basically, the resources required, not too bad. However, it's quite unnecessary, unless you've already got a bunch of aluminium ingots left over. This is a very difficult recipe to try and talk about, but I hope that I've been able to present it in a clear way, as best as I can. Also, very quickly to point out, there are some other ways you can actually make your aluminium ingots. This is just the simplest way. The final recipe for our steel beams is the molded beam recipe, which requires steel ingots, like what we were making before, and concrete. Let's start off with the concrete, since it's the easiest one to talk about. We have to use 35.6 concrete per minute, which consumes 106.8 limestone. Moving on to our steel ingots now, where we're only going to consume 53.4 per minute. Compare this to the 80 steel ingots we were consuming for our basic recipe. So this molded beam recipe does save you on iron, and it saves you on coal. Because as we can see, we're only using about 35.6 coal per minute, and 35.6 iron per minute. So yeah, this is actually really, really good. The only downside obviously is the limestone, but that's still not too bad. There's also another way that you can make your concrete which consumes less limestone. Regular viewers of the channel know exactly where we're going. That is right, it's the refinery, where you can make some fantastic recipes. Here you can combine your caterium or your copper, iron, or even your raw quartz to essentially get the final product that you want, whether that's quartz crystals or your other ingots, which cost a lot less raw resources but require water. You can also do this for your concrete as well. So if you want to try and get your 35.6 concrete per minute, rather than consuming 106 limestone, you're now only consuming 53.4, which is a significant amount less than what you were using originally. In fact, it's half of what you were consuming. The only downside is that now you need water, and quite a lot of water. And of course, you have to try and find a way to get your water to your refinery. So it does add the extra challenge of water and liquid logistics. But overall, if you're trying to save out on limestone or iron or copper, like we were talking about here with the pure ingot recipes, then using the refinery can be a fantastic way to do so. And honestly, the power consumption is not that bad either. In fact, one would say it's pretty good. So let's combine all three of these recipes. The first one, the basic recipe, only requires iron ore and coal. Unfortunately, it consumes the most amount of iron ore and the most amount of coal per minute, which is not fantastic. The second recipe consumes the least amount of coal, and also technically the most amount of water, which is not fantastic, and it also consumes bauxite, but it doesn't consume iron. I would reckon though that bauxite is far more important than iron is, so do bear that in mind. And finally, for our molded beam recipe, we are consuming quite a lot of limestone, but we are consuming a very small amount of iron and a very small amount of coal, and is also the best, just about the best when you compare it to this recipe, in regards of saving power. So I would say that the best recipe for the steel beams is this molded beam recipe right here. I use it in my world and I think it's very, very good. I also do think the basic recipe is fine if you don't mind consuming extra iron and extra coal, so that's completely up to you. Moving on to our final three recipes now, and we've got our steel pipe recipes. There are three different ways to make these steel pipes. The first of which being the regular steel ingot to steel pipe recipe, which is not too bad. The second one being the iron pipe recipe, which only consumes iron, which is fantastic, especially if you've seen my last couple of videos, you know how much I love this. And the third one is the molded steel pipe. We just talked about the molded steel beam in our last example, and now we've got roughly a very similar recipe, but for our pipes. Starting off with our basic steel pipe recipe, and again we are going to be making 20 steel pipes throughout all three of these recipes. To make these pipes you are going to need 40 steel ingots, and using our steel ingot recipe, that comes out to 27 iron ore and 27 coal to make your 20 steel pipes. To make that, you also need 1 foundry, 1 smelter and 2 constructors, which in total will set you back around about 28 megawatts. Overall, this recipe is not too bad, but let's say you don't want to use any coal. Well, luckily our second iron pipe recipe might be the one for you, because it's by far the easiest recipe to make here. This is absolutely amazing, as you can already tell. We are using 80 iron ore to make our 80 iron ingots, then 80 iron ingots to make our steel pipe. Unfortunately, the 4 iron ingot to 1 steel pipe ratio is quite steep, but considering you are just using iron, I don't think this is too bad at all, because it's a lot easier to find 1 iron node than it is to find 1 coal node and an iron node right next to each other, and potentially even a limestone node and a sulfur node next to each other, things like that. So this recipe is nice and simple, and also the power consumption's not that bad. We are consuming 28 megawatts, whereas our first recipe, again, we're also consuming 28 megawatts. So I would say that this iron pipe recipe is not bad at all. And you might even recognize this final recipe. The molded pipe is the exact same layout as our molded beam recipe, where instead of making 20 steel beams, we're making 20 steel pipes. Here, this consumes our 20 steel ingots, which is not that bad at all. 13.4 coal is basically nothing, right? And 13.4 iron ore is, again, a very low number. And to make our concrete, we are using 36 limestone. You can also use the wet concrete recipe, which consumes less limestone, but also consumes water. You could also use our pure iron ingots recipe, but again, that also consumes water as well, and a refinery, which is extra power and is not really needed for this basic recipe. Overall, we are consuming 27 megawatts, which is just about our lowest power consumption recipe of the 3. We also need 2 foundries, 1 smelter, and 1 constructor. So very, very simple stuff to make this, and in total, again, this is what we are using. So what is the best steel pipe recipe to make? Well, that is really up to you. The basic recipe is just okay if you don't want to consume limestone. The iron pipe recipe is fantastic if you just want to consume iron. And the molded pipe recipe is fantastic if you don't want to consume a lot of any of these 3 items. Because again, 36 limestone, 13.4 iron ore, 13.4 coal, like this is a very small amount of resources, which is not too bad at all. And power consumption wise, they're all pretty much the exact same. So trying to find the best steel pipe recipe is actually rather difficult to try and do, considering they're all relatively good. But for simplicity reasons, I would say that iron pipe is the best recipe. But in regards of saving resources, especially coal, which you might want to use later on, I'd probably say that the molded pipe is the best recipe for steel pipes. But this is probably a heavily debated subject, so let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think is the best steel pipe recipe? And that will just about do it for today. Oh, I've fallen through the map. That will just about do it for today's video. Thank you very much for watching, and have an amazing rest of your day. Before we go, a massive shout out to the Knights of the Realm channel members. We have Asuna Yuki, Variance, Natormal, Yamikel Burns, Yosh Rising, Scotland Hattie, and Mau Mau. If you decide to become a Knight of the Realm for just £2.99 a month, you get access to channel-only emotes, unique badges, and also shoutouts in videos. Memberships are the best way to support my channel, but you don't have to become a member. Even just by watching today's video, you are supporting the channel massively. Here's a couple more videos I've made that you might be interested in. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Have an amazing rest of your day, and remember, Godspeed.